"Get out of this house, you fat pig!" Dylan's scream hit me so hard my chest tightened. I stood by the kitchen doorway, my hands trembling, staring at my son and Jessica with a look I had never seen in either of them, cold, cruel, and frighteningly unfamiliar. Outside, Seattle was sinking into darkness. A light rain streaked across the window panes, catching the soft yellow glow of the apartment I'd called home for 30 years. I could feel every beat of my heart, hear Dylan's shoes pounding against the polished wooden floor, hear Jessica's little snicker behind him sharp like a knife sliding under my ribs. But before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for the next chapters. I tried to stay calm, but those words "fat pig" kept echoing in my head, pounding out a betrayal I never imagined. Every step they took toward me tightened the air like the whole room was about to explode, and in that moment I realized this wasn't just an argument. This was a war without warning. A place where I either stood my ground or lost everything. My name is Everlyn, 65. A mother who spent her whole life pouring every bit of herself into this family, now standing in the dim gray light of a Seattle evening, drowning in loneliness and betrayal. Dylan, my little boy, once curled in my arms, had turned into the villain of my story, and Jessica, my daughter-in-law, no longer the sweet girl she used to be, but a cold, calculating partner in his cruelty. In that instant, my heart split open. Pain, fury, disappointment, all crashing into each other. Yet beneath it all, a small spark flickered. Something sharper, something I hadn't felt in years. I would not let them win. A part of me wanted to run, but another part, older, wiser, and far more dangerous, was already planning the kind of revenge they would never see coming. I knew, just one mistake from them, and everything would turn. After Dylan spat out those cruel words, the whole room felt wrapped in a thick, suffocating silence. I stood there not because I was weak, but because my mind was trying to make sense of the scene in front of me. Dylan, the son I raised on carefully counted dollars, was looking at me not like a child looks at his mother, but like a man removing an obstacle. Jessica folded her arms beside him, satisfaction written all over her face. She looked me up and down like she was evaluating an outdated piece of furniture. Her perfect blonde curls bounced lightly when she scoffed. "Hurry up, Everlyn! I've got dinner plans!" I drew a long breath, not to calm myself, but to keep from saying something foolish. After 65 years on this earth, I know exactly when to keep quiet and watch. "Dylan," I said, softly, low, steady, filled with a pain that surprised even me. "Do you really want your mother to leave this house?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Jessica just like that little 8-year-old boy who used to ask me if he could bring his stuffed bear to a friend's sleepover. And when Jessica nodded, a small, poisonous nod, he turned back to me. "I want you to leave," he said. Smooth, clean, not a tremor in his voice. Each word slipped from his mouth like a blade landing straight in my chest. My hands tightened, but I would not let them see me weak. Not now, not ever. I placed the blanket on the chair, slow, deliberate. Ironically, that calmness made Jessica frown. Maybe she expected me to scream, to cry, to beg, but I simply straightened my back and met my son's eyes. "All right," I said, "if that's what you want." A flicker of surprise crossed Dylan's face. They hadn't planned for quiet acceptance. But I'd learned something over many long years: when they think they've already won, that's when the real fight begins. Jessica dragged out a bright red suitcase I had never seen before, shiny, expensive, wrong. She pushed it against my leg with a scowl. "My mom threw out all your clothes. This is all that's left. Take it." I looked at the suitcase. I didn't bother opening it. I didn't care what they thought they were letting me have. But I did notice Dylan's hand tucked in his pocket, trembling ever so slightly. That told me more than any apology or cruelty ever could. I turned away. I wouldn't let them see the tears in my eyes. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, the wind cutting sharp against my face. It woke me up, almost as if the world was whispering a warning I had ignored for far too long. I stood under the porch for a few breaths, staring at the heavy wooden door as it slammed shut behind me. The door to the home I'd bought with my own hard-earned money, after years working in a cramped accounting office downtown. The place I thought would hold me through the rest of my life. Now the door was closed, and it wasn't my home anymore. But what twisted the knife wasn't being thrown out. It was the way they did it, cold as strangers, cruel with intention. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't random. There was something in Jessica's eyes, and in the way Dylan stood behind her, that made me understand. They'd been planning this for a long time. I stepped down the stairs, dragging that red suitcase behind me. But my steps didn't falter. The ache in my chest mixed with something else, a small, sharp flame rising inside me. A strange stillness settled in my mind, and I knew what that meant. I hadn't lost. Behind that closed door, maybe Jessica was laughing. Maybe Dylan was relieved. But I understood one thing with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. They had awakened the smartest, coldest, most dangerous part of me, the part I thought I'd buried long ago. And from the moment I walked away from that house, I knew the real game had just begun. That night, after that heavy door slammed behind me, I sat in my old car, my hand still gripping that red suitcase. Seattle at night was so cold I could feel the wind slicing through my thick sweater. But that chill was nothing compared to the cold of betrayal. I didn't cry. I never cried over losing things. What broke me was the cruelty of my own flesh and blood. But tears weren't going to save me. I needed a plan. And slowly, an idea began to take shape. I couldn't let Dylan and Jessica believe they'd won. The next morning I went back to that house, this time with a perfectly legal reason. I was still the owner on the bank account, still holding most of the property documents, still tied to every asset that mattered. While they were busy throwing me out, I'd been preparing my own weapon, a legal file I had kept hidden for years, waiting for the right moment. I walked down to my little basement office, the room where I used to sort bills, receipts, contracts. In the bottom drawer, I opened the old safe, a dusty thing Dylan and Jessica never suspected. Inside were notarized copies of the house, deed proof of ownership, and most important, a special agreement my husband signed before he passed. It gave me full authority over the property in case of any family dispute. I held those papers, my heart beating fast, but my hands steady. With this file, Dylan and Jessica couldn't take the house. They couldn't take anything. They had underestimated me terribly. And then, I found something I had almost forgotten. A letter. Anonymous, but written by my husband back in 2015. A record of the odd, dishonest financial things Dylan and Jessica had done, withdrawals behind my back, secret transfers, small betrayals I'd never been told about. His handwriting felt like a cold knife, a reminder that they weren't just greedy, they were reckless. And recklessness always comes with consequences. I held the papers under that soft yellow light and smiled. Not a joyful smile, but the quiet smile of someone who has just found the perfect weapon. With this, I wouldn't just keep what was mine. I could make them regret every cruel word they ever threw at me. But I wasn't in a rush. To win, I needed time, observation, precision. I spent the whole morning reading each contract, each note, every signature. Every detail mattered. And the more I read, the stronger I felt. The pain of betrayal was turning into something sharper power. That afternoon I left the house again, but not as someone being pushed out. I walked out with purpose. I went to see the family lawyer, a man Dylan and Jessica didn't even remember existed. One look at my face and he knew I wasn't there to beg. I was there to claim what was rightfully mine. I handed him the entire file, the deeds, the agreements, the old letter, and I saw the shock in his eyes. "This," he said slowly, "is exactly what we need. If we act carefully, Dylan and Jessica won't be able to escape any of this." I nodded, a mix of excitement and tension tightening my breath. The battlefield had only just opened, and I wasn't about to forgive the cold cruelty of my son and daughter-in-law. Driving home, I watched the rain streak across Seattle's roads, the streetlights shimmering like silver threads in the night. I felt a small, quiet laugh rise in my chest. They thought they'd erased me, but all they'd done was clear the path for my revenge. That night I sat by the window with a cup of hot tea, watching the rain glitter on the pavement. My heart felt calm and on fire at the same time. They had awakened a part of me, sharp, clever, ruthless, that I thought had slept for years, and I knew, the moment Dylan or Jessica made one wrong move, everything would collapse beneath them. And I, Evelyn Sterling, the 65-year-old mother they called a fat pig, the woman they threw out of her own home, was ready. The legal war hadn't begun yet, but my weaponry was in place. That night, sitting by the window watching the rain fall like it was counting the seconds of my life, I knew everything I'd done was only the warm-up. This wasn't a war won by weapons, it was won by timing. And my timing, my golden hour, had finally arrived. I spent the whole night thinking about Dylan and Jessica, not to mourn them anymore, but to study them the way a strategist studies her enemies. Dylan, impulsive, impatient, easily pleased with himself. Jessica, sweet on the surface, but underneath, bottomless ambition. And their biggest weakness, they believed I was weak. I took a sip of tea and smiled softly. Good. Let them think that. Early the next morning, my lawyer called. He told me every document I'd handed him was valid, more than enough to request court intervention. But what startled me was how he looked at me, even through the phone, as if I was no longer the mother thrown out of her home but a woman stepping toward victory. I advise you, he said, don't move yet. Let them dig deeper. Then we strike. I nodded. That was exactly what I intended. I began monitoring Dylan and Jessica's finances through the access they didn't know I still had. Within days, I found large transfers to a suspicious account and a contract for a new apartment, something they could never afford without touching what belonged to me. And that was the first golden moment. The second they misused my assets, the law would side with me. All I had to do was watch and let them slip the noose around their own necks. One evening, I drove back to the old house just as Dylan was getting into his car. His eyes flickered when he saw me. Not guilt, fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear that I might ruin whatever scheme he and Jessica had built. I lowered my voice. Dylan, I just want to talk. He sighed. Mom, don't make this harder. I smiled. The kind of smile that makes a guilty person tense up. Harder. Oh, sweetheart. I haven't even started. I watched his eyes twitch. Jessica stood in the doorway, frowning, her lips tight. I let them see how calm I was, because nothing unsettles an enemy more than a woman who's quiet and dangerous. That night, I sent my lawyer the list of suspicious transactions. He replied with only one line: the golden hour is open. 3 days later, I moved to step 2, gathering direct evidence. I went to my late husband's company, where Dylan now held a deputy director position. I wasn't there to confront anyone. I was there to observe. As I walked through the lobby, some employees nodded, some stared, some looked at me with sympathy. I ignored all of them. I met an old employee who worked with my husband for 20 years. I casually asked about Dylan. Her face shifted hesitation, discomfort. She whispered that Dylan had been using the company's name to borrow assets, and several internal documents were under review for possible misconduct. I thanked her, stepped outside, and stood beneath the maple trees, losing their leaves. A cold ripple slid down my spine. No, not from the wind. From the truth, Dylan and Jessica were digging their own grave. That evening, I decided it was time for the final pull, the thread that would tighten the trap. I sent Dylan a short text. I know what you're doing. I'm giving you one last chance to tell the truth. Hours later, he called back, his voice sharp with arrogance. Stop interfering. Everything is mine. Whatever you're holding on to, it's useless. I listened to every word, every breath soaked in pride, and I knew he had just signed his own sentence. I sent the recording to my lawyer. He was silent for a few seconds before saying, "We have enough. Soon they'll have no escape." That night, sitting alone with the rain tapping against the window, my heart was beating fast. But it no longer hurt. The pain had morphed into something else: resolve. I wasn't seeking revenge to destroy Dylan. I was seeking revenge so he would finally understand. Betraying a mother is a debt no one can ever pay. And in the darkness, I smiled. Tomorrow, I would begin step 4, dragging every last truth into the light. That morning, as I stepped out of the small room I was renting, I could feel something different in the air. Seattle's wind was colder than usual, the sky a heavy gray, as if announcing a storm no one could avoid. Yet my steps felt strangely light, as though everything that was about to happen had been prepared long ago. My lawyer called me at 8 a.m. Everlyn, the court has accepted the petition. We've been granted an emergency hearing. The evidence you provided is overwhelming. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling my heart beat like a war drum. It had arrived. The moment I'd been waiting for. The moment they never believed would come. When I walked into the King County Courthouse, Dylan and Jessica were already seated. Jessica wore the expensive white dress I once bought for her, as if it could paint her innocent. And Dylan, his face was tight with the tension he tried so hard to hide behind defiance. I sat down across from them. Dylan's eyes met mine, full of anger, confusion, and fear. For the first time in years, I knew my son was no longer on the offensive. He was defending himself. The hearing began. My lawyer stood, opened the file. He didn't need to say much. Just one line. The defendants used my client's personal assets without authorization, committed financial fraud, and forcibly removed her from her legal residence. Piece by piece, evidence flashed onto the large screen: transfer records, the deposit contract for the new apartment, the recording where Dylan confessed. With every document displayed, I saw Dylan's shoulders tense while Jessica's face turned a shade paler. They started denying everything. Dylan shot up from his chair. That was my money. My mother gave it to me. The judge's gaze was cold. Do you have any evidence of that? Silence filled the room. Dylan's hands were trembling and Jessica was clenching his arms so tightly her knuckles turned white. My lawyer struck at the perfect moment, Your Honor. Here is the will left by Mrs. Everlin's late husband. The division is clear. 75% belongs to her. No one may use it without written consent. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I simply sat still, hands folded, calm, like someone who already knew the ending. When the judge called a recess to verify the documents, Dylan suddenly lost control. He rushed toward me, eyes red, voice strangled. Why are you doing this? You know, we needed that money to start over. I looked up, my voice steady. Dylan, you can start your life with your own effort, not by throwing your mother out onto the street. The words sliced through whatever illusion he'd been holding on to. He shoved a chair aside, the loud clatter bringing security over. Jessica shrank back, face drained. I looked at them, one born from my own blood, the other who once called me mom, and felt no anger anymore. Only a truth that had taken too long to accept. I had loved the wrong people for far too long. When the hearing resumed, the judge issued the temporary ruling. Dylan and Jessica are prohibited from using any assets tied to me. I am granted the right to return to my residence while awaiting the formal trial. An internal investigation into Dylan's financial misconduct at the company will be opened. The courtroom erupted. Jessica covered her face and cried, but it wasn't remorse. It was the cry of someone who had just lost what they believed they were entitled to. Dylan stood frozen, as if the world had collapsed around him. I gathered my documents and walked past them. Mom, don't do this, Dylan called after me, voice shaking. I stopped, turned, and looked straight into the eyes I once held the moment he was born. A wave of bitterness rose in me, but my voice remained gentle. It isn't me doing this, Dylan. It's the path you chose. Then I walked away. No looking back. No hesitation. No softness. That night, as I opened the door to the apartment, the same one I had been forced out of, I felt a new kind of silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of a victory not yet complete. Because I knew tomorrow, when the investigation begins, Dylan and Jessica will face a collapse far greater than today's, and I, Everlyn, will be there in the front row. 2 weeks after that emergency hearing, my apartment in downtown Seattle was finally back under my full ownership. The place still carried the scent of oak and morning coffee, the things I've always loved, but today they felt different. Every little detail in that room reminded me that I had stood up after a devastating blow, stronger than ever. A new stack of letters came from my attorney, financial reports, legal documents, everything neatly laid out. I couldn't help but smile. Dylan and Jessica, the same two who once called me a fat pig with such contempt, no longer had a place in my life. What I felt wasn't bitterness. It was relief. Justice had finally found its way back to me. But I also knew the real victory wouldn't end in court. Dylan, with his temper and that foolish pride, would try to strike back, so I had to move first, quietly, wisely. That night I sat at my desk and began planning. No rushing, just steady, careful steps. I combed through every record, every bank statement, every connection those two still had. And in that mountain of paper I found tiny cracks, mistakes in their rental contracts, odd gaps in their personal investments, and inconsistencies in the company files Dylan once managed. Little details, but powerful ones. A few days later, a real estate firm called me. Mrs. Everlyn, we noticed several irregular payments tied to contracts Dylan signed. My voice stayed calm. Keep every document exactly as it is, and notify me before doing anything else. I hung up and smiled. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the perfect legal counterstrike. Quiet, clean, impossible to deny. That same week, Dylan and Jessica received a notice from the tax authorities. Jessica cried. Dylan panicked. From my window on the second floor, I watched their faces twist in confusion and fear. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free, as if years of betrayal had finally drifted off my shoulders. That evening, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window while Seattle glowed under a fiery sunset. A soft breeze slipped through the curtains, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep, steady peace inside me. All that hurt, all that cruelty, I had turned them into strength. I was no longer that weak mom they mocked. I was a woman who owned her life, clear-headed, sharp, and powerful. I thought back to the courtroom 2 weeks earlier, the way Dylan and Jessica sat there stunned while the judge read the ruling. And in that moment, I understood something. Happiness and freedom don't come from loud revenge. They come from winning with intelligence and patience. I stayed quiet and let them expose themselves. Let them fall under the weight of their own choices. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the things I loved, fixing up my apartment, joining a volunteer group, even opening a small reading room for the community. With every passing day, I felt myself coming alive again, not just in my home, but in my spirit. I learned to love myself, set boundaries, and never again let anyone step over my right to exist. And Dylan, Jessica, they're still tangled in the very legal trouble they created. I don't need to lift a finger anymore. I won by letting them face the consequences on their own. This quiet, steady victory speaks louder than any shouting match or dramatic revenge ever could. One evening, I stood alone in my living room, the sunset pouring through the windows, and I whispered to myself, "Evelyn, you've lived enough, hurt enough, and now it's your time to be happy. No one gets to call you a fat pig ever again. You're in control now." A wave of peace washed over me. But deep inside, I kept a small spark, just enough to remind myself that real strength doesn't come from pushing others down, it comes from standing up steady and confident. A different ending, but the same truth. Evelyn won, and no one can take her life back from her. Thank you, all of you, for following my story, this long journey from pain and betrayal to victory and freedom. If you'd like to keep walking with me, to explore more stories filled with emotion, tension, and the quiet lessons life hands us about family and resilience, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the little notification bell. I'm grateful for every single person who listened, and I hope to see you again in the next chapter of my stories.